Imagine you're trying to do some work on your house that requires a permit from your local county or city. You've probably had to dig through their website for a while, hope you land on the correct form to submit, and then pray that you fill it all out correctly and send it to the right person or office. Worst case, you may even need to go down to the county office or town hall to speak with someone in person. And they're only available during a few hours that are the most inconvenient during the workday. And heaven forbid you have to do all this just to register your new bicycle, which I found out through this conversation is required in some states, crazy enough. Well, our guest today, Kris Sandor, started a company to solve all these issues. He's a Naval Academy grad, former policy advisor, worked at McKinsey and Palantir, was CEO of Citi Bike, which was acquired by Lyft, got his MBA at Stanford. I mean, the impressive list goes on. But he's currently the CEO of Readily, an AI platform dedicated to making companies and local governments operate more efficiently. He's got all kinds of insights for transitioning service members and for veteran entrepreneurs in this episode. So thanks for joining us for this conversation with Kris Sandor. Most people you talk to when transitioning out of the military have never actually transitioned out themselves. You're probably getting a bunch of opinions from people who plan on staying in until retirement and have no idea how to actually show empathy for your situation. This podcast is about providing fresh perspectives and a front row seat for conversations with successful veterans doing big things after leaving the military.
Good to see you as well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure, man. How are things going?
Super busy, but all really good things. All really good things right now.
Yeah. I have to imagine your days are in the trenches, getting the hands dirty on a daily basis.
Yeah, and we have a really strong sales pipeline. So if I could spend literally all day on sales, we'd be better for it. While we're also some fundraising and keeping clients happy and building our product and just everything at the same time, strategic partnerships. So it's all good things. It's all good things.
Well, I imagine most founders would prefer to be on sales all day, not have to deal with the back office
I think
headaches.
most founders might not want to be, depending on their skill set, might not want to be on sales all day, but on sales in the sense that like I know there's immediate ROI to like just more and more cold, not warm lead follow up and so on. I love working with clients and actually helping them solve their problems. So it's
There
like
you
if
go.
somebody else could do all the work, get me to that first meeting, then I'm happy.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Most founders would prefer to
Yeah,
be talking to clients,
that's right.
making
Yeah.
money rather than
Yeah,
dealing with
exactly.
payroll or
Yeah,
taxes or
solving
whatever.
problems. Yeah.
Yeah. What you got into
Yeah.
entrepreneurship to do in the first place.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
it's great to see you. So Jack and I served in the army together.
Jack, good to
We,
meet you.
yeah,
Yeah, you too. Excited to chat.
Yeah.
we were stationed in Germany together while in the army and started this podcast because, the military transition process leaves a lot to be desired, regardless of branch of service. And we feel like there's a lot of amazing stories from people like yourself that can give folks transitioning out a better picture into what's possible afterwards. And so that's kind of the impetus for this. So excited to jump into your story. And we always start off by zooming in on your military transition process, but a little bit about your service as well. So if you like, we can go ahead and jump in there, with a little bit about your military service, but specifically zooming into your transition.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about my background and military experience. Grew up small town New Jersey, suburban, public school, got accepted to the Naval Academy. That was my top choice. After my time at the academy, I went into the submarine force, stationed in Groton, Connecticut, fast attack submarines. And then when it came time for my shore tour, I did go through a decision process of do I stay in? I actually did like a 2-column pros cons thing at the advice of a mentor at that time. Ended up going after a really basically the hardest billet that I could get, or the biggest leadership jump, which was working at a defense agency in DC, essentially as a diplomat, traveling to Russia, working with the Russian government on bioterror threat reduction, and then decided to separate from the military. I can get into the details of how I decided that, but essentially felt that going onto a department head tour for submarines was not how I wanted to spend my time, but more like where I thought my skill set was and where I thought I could be most effective. And got out with the intention of, finding something that, whether it's a diplomatic role or going into, I was obviously looking at both diplomatic versus like commercial, ultimately applied to business school with the potential intention of post-business school going back into government. but not really being entirely sure. Was fortunate enough to get accepted into Stanford, and application to business school was really at the advice of another Naval Academy friend. And once I got accepted, then I went through my journey from there. But that's sort of a lot to digest, and I can get into the details of the decision making there.
Yeah, if we could just take a second, but you've got such an impressive track record. I don't want to loom on any area too long, but if we could take a second to talk about your kind of the two-column decision-making process you used when getting out of the Navy, and then how that informed the decision to go into kind of the policy role afterwards, or the more government kind of advising role, and then if that was the same system you used for Stanford Business School, and if that's the same system you use today, and kind of how you go about these decisions just in general.
Yeah, so the two-column decision process was actually after towards the end of my sea tour, deciding if I wanted to do a shore tour. So I had essentially completed my commitment, and did I want to then go do another couple years? And the decision there was the what I don't remember everything that went on that piece of paper, but a lot of it was, what do I actually want to how do I want to spend my time? What was exciting for me? What skill sets did I want to build? What kind of people did I want to be around? And could I find that in the Navy within like a shore tour opportunity? Or was it impossible and I needed to go try to find that somewhere else? And ultimately, when I was talking with the detailer, there were multiple opportunities where I could have that need fulfilled, that I could achieve those goals, the things that I wanted to accomplish in the next couple of years, skills I wanted to build, the type of leader I wanted to continue to grow into. And that was my decision to stay in the Navy at that time and pursue that shore tour. Towards the end of that shore tour, because it was more diplomatic focused, it was then really, where can I be most effective? Like as a person, where can I have the biggest impact? And also, where am I going to be successful? And I felt I could go back as a department head on a submarine. And so you guys are both Army in the Navy context. You're typically going out, you're a junior officer, you then go do a shore tour, you come back as a department head, shore tour, XO, shore tour, captain. It kind of progresses. And as a department head, I thought, well, I could do it. I don't know if I would be the best department head. And if I didn't think that I could be really exceptional at it, then is it something that I should really be doing? Am I going to be happy doing it? And is this kind of how I want to spend my time? In the sense of, I was very motivated by public service, but on a submarine, you're a collector of information rather than a decision maker on that information. And my background, political science at the Naval Academy, et cetera, I was much more focused on how do I become a decision maker of that information. And that's really what led me to think about leaving.
Yeah, I think there's two big takeaways to hone in there is one simple, write your process down, right? When we're in the military, we're surrounded by people who have stayed in, and just by writing our thoughts and actually showing what the decision is between the two and assigning some values to it, that's a great way to actually get your thoughts on paper and actually do a little bit of an analysis. And the other thing you said that I love is, will you be the best at that specific role? And I've heard in the past, like a Venn diagram with three circles. One is, can you make enough money just to like support your family? You don't have to be rich,
Yeah.
but can you make enough money? The second one is, are you going to enjoy what you're doing? And then the third one is, can you be the best in the world? And it doesn't have to be the best in the world, but are you going to be successful doing that?
Right.
And we've used that. We've like really tried to push that with soldiers thinking of career transitions and figuring out how to do that. And it sounds like you probably did a version of that. And like, am I going to be incredibly good at this? And if you're wanting to pursue greatness, then you should probably pursue things that you can be good at. So that's awesome. I love that you highlighted that.
And by the way, while I was on my short tour, I did apply to become a foreign area officer, which is essentially a U.S. you'd be a diplomat in the military. You guys know what FAOs are. But I got turned down because they wanted me to go do more time on the submarine. So that I did explore that avenue before saying, okay, this is the decision I have to make.
And then going the graduate school route, was that something that you had thought of long in advance, or was that you mentioned a colleague or a peer had recommended going that direction? How did that come about?
I'm the type of person that I want to ask five people their opinions and get their thoughts and hear their experiences. And so, I had friends that were going to applying for law schools. I had friends that I had already been to business school. I had friends doing all sorts of different things. And I just tried to talk to as many people as I could to understand what their experience was, what their perspectives were, and ultimately like triangulate and kind of navigate my way into what I thought was a good answer for me, where I, at least, the decision I was making, I thought I was well informed and I had a reasonable amount of comfort that I was making that decision based off of information that was real and I was educating myself on what was out there and that it made sense for me, even if ultimately there's another decision I could have made that might have been optimally better. Like if you're playing a video game and you just keep hitting reset a million times. But I had confidence that that decision to go to business school was a good decision for me at that time.
You mentioned asking five people who have been there or made that decision before. I imagine that's a trait that has paid huge dividends being in the startup world, asking potential customers or
Yeah.
vendors or whoever, really getting market feedback before jumping into something. Is that just kind of naturally how you are, how you're wired, or where does that come from? And I guess a second part to that question is how do you find the right people to ask? As you're thinking about, is it as simple now as looking on LinkedIn, or is it asking through other people, or how do you go about finding the right people?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, so to answer the last question, at the time, LinkedIn wasn't super fleshed out, but even now, I would go talk to people that I thought were respected and knowledgeable and ask them who I should talk to. So even if you don't know that person, but you know somebody who might know some other people, and they're happy to give you an introduction, which I'm sure is, even today for me, certainly, and just try to get that like 15, 20 minutes and just ask a couple questions. And when you talk to enough people, you'll start to get a sense of what might make sense. In terms of where this comes from, that's a great question. I was thinking about this ahead of the call, but while I was on a submarine on my ship, I definitely had some what we would call near misses, which is like you screw up some procedure that you didn't follow the procedure, you did something wrong, and in particular, there was a bunch of like calculations I had to make on one specific watch to add chemicals to the nuclear reactor. And the chemist comes in and he's like, "Sir, here's the calculations." And I like didn't really know how to do it. I had done it enough times. I had a sense of it, but I wasn't like really good at it. And I'm like, "Well, this guy does this every day, right? So it's got to be good." And so I'm like, "Check." Well, it turns out he does sort of do it every day, but he had the same level of confidence I had. He was relying on me as the officer to be the expert. So he puts in the wrong amount of chemicals. And of course, this like all pops out in the testing. And my lesson learned from that, and by the way, after that, having gone through the process of investigation and sitting in front of the captain and everybody else, I got really good at that. I was like the best on the ship at those calculations and really pushed on the other JOs like you guys got to figure this out too, because I knew other people weren't as confident. And my lesson learned there was you have to be the master of that topic. Like you really have to go deep to where you feel really comfortable that you understand this at a level that you can competently explain it and teach it to somebody else. And so in the decision making process of do I get out, it was a little bit of that, which is like, how do I become well enough educated on this decision, on what exactly is business school or law school or leaving the military, going into the corporate life? What are the challenges I'm going to face that I could, without having done it like that big of a leap, turn around and talk to somebody else as they're also going through that process because I now have enough knowledge and I can speak to it with a reasonable amount of authority to help them through that process. And that then extends, of course, into startup or anything else where there are a lot of people that are like winging it. And I can talk to where this also came into play later on, immediately after business school, in my first job post business school, that, there's a lot of people out there kind of winging it, but you really have to become a reasonable master of these topics, whatever it is that you're doing, to be able to make those good decisions.
All I could think about was, thank goodness the Army had nothing involving a nuclear reactor, because the closest thing that Jack and I got to that was a antiquated computer system in a Humvee that you just drop terrible icons onto, or maybe a compass. But we're very thankful. No, that's a great segue, Kris. Can you talk about your transition to McKinsey and kind of post graduate school experiences as well?
Yeah, so coming out of the military, I knew that I had skill sets in leadership and following process. But for the corporate sector, I thought, I need to really build out some harder skills, build out my toolkit. I looked to consulting because I thought it would help build a good foundation, understanding of business, understanding of different business units, critical thinking, problem solving, which it did for sure. On my first project while I was at McKinsey, I was working with another Navy veteran, and I was winging it a little bit, right, on the project. And he said, Kris, everybody here is really smart, but you can't survive here. You can't excel here by winging it. Because everybody got here kind of by winging it to some degree, but you can't stay here and you can't excel or be successful winging it. So now it's taking everything that you know and your smarts and intelligence, et cetera, and now you got to put in the hard work, right? And that I think that was a really great lesson that I have taken forward. And I think as you get into it, there's a lot of smart people out there in the world, but the people that are the most successful are the ones that are they're just putting in the hours. They're putting in a lot of hard work.
That was a big takeaway just from the military, but it's applied to anything, right? Like you can be successful through just hard work, even if you're not that smart.
Sure,
And you can be
definitely.
successful by winging it, like you said, but the people who are truly, quite successful, they have both, and they both of them are something you can work on. It's not just a fixed, hey, you can work on your smarts and you can work on your work ethic, but the work ethic is more so a choice, as you indicated. I think that's a great takeaway. But when you're transitioning out, it's a brand new steep learning curve. So how did you tackle it? Like, I want to ask specifically about the transition from business school on, like, how did the jargon translate? Obviously, there's leadership skills you learned from the Navy, but there's a whole separate, language that is spoken in the corporate sector. So what did you do to kind of fit in to that mold?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say that you're probably assuming that more of that jargon is applicable to that problem that you're trying to solve in the moment than is actually true. So, if you're going to, in the consulting world, if you're going to like a new company, well, they have their own processes, they have their own language, they have their own acronyms. And yes, at a high level in the corporate world, you have like, okay, what is private equity? What is EBITDA? What is ARR? What does VC mean? What's a seed round? Da 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 da. But when you get into the actual nuts and bolts of like what is a given person or a manager or an employee doing, what is a process? That just comes back to everything we've just talked about, which is, okay, let me go ask you 30 questions about what it is that you're doing. And if I don't know something, what I've also learned over the years is that anytime I don't know something, there's at least one other person in the room who also doesn't understand it either, but nobody's raising their hand. And your assumption that just because I came from the military and this is a new world and everybody speaks a different language, so if they're talking about something and I don't understand it, it must just be because I don't speak their language. That's probably not true. It's most likely that, yes, if it's some like finance term, then just ask a question like, I don't understand that, or write it down, look it up. So much easier to look things up now. Go ask ChatGPT or Google it. There are also great books on, basic accounting. There's online programs you can take. Corporate Finance Institute has super cheap courses on financial terms and accounting, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, it just comes down to just asking questions and being comfortable with the fact that you don't know and that that's okay. And there's actually other people know less than you think.
I love that. So asking questions, putting in the work. Were there any other ingredients in this, in kind of moving from the winging it to being a contributing member of X organization that
Yeah.
you found helpful?
One of the things with consulting that was different, in the submarine force, there are times when if something goes wrong, you have to know what you're doing. You follow the steps. There is critical thinking. There is problem solving, 100%. There is a lot of time spent where you're just there. And you might work 48 hours straight, but, and that's hard mentally, physically, and you are doing things that require knowledge. But your brain at any given moment may not be going at 120%. When I started to get into consulting, and it's, you spend all day thinking as hard as you possibly can on stuff that you've many cases never seen before. It's all new to you and everybody else in the room. And then you go have dinner and then you go back to your room and then you got to think as hard as you can for another 4 hours. And that's what I mean by putting in the hard work. It's not just showing up and putting in the hours and I was here till 8 o'clock, or every day I go to work and I come home at 9 o'clock. It's not that. It's like, are you working? Are you pushing yourself as hard as you can for that 12 hours, 14 hours, whatever it is that you're doing? And then if you're sitting down on the weekend to do more work, are you really pushing yourself? And that's where all the value is being generated. It's not just by showing up, it's by thinking big thoughts, thinking hard thoughts, trying to invent things, coming up with new ideas, pushing yourself to get to that next level of understanding.
What was the goal? Were you thinking, hey, McKinsey could be a 30-year career afterwards, or was it to gain some quick knowledge and understanding of how that side of the world worked? Or, did you have some long-term goals that you were looking to, or maybe that you developed in business school?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it leads into one of the points of advice that I wanted to dispense to other folks that might be listening to this. McKinsey it's an incredible organization. And I, at the time, was thinking, I was initially seeing like, okay, how long would I want to stay here? But I ultimately wanted to go to other organizations that I thought were more innovative, especially working on technology. I left McKinsey to go to Palantir. I was very interested in Palantir from, even the earlier time at McKinsey. But I could have benefited from staying at McKinsey longer. And I had friends that were there when I was there, and very similar skill set. They weren't, same level of output, same level of everything. And they've stayed and they've had really great careers. And to some extent, grass is always greener a little bit, but I would say if you're transitioning out of the military and you're looking to go to an organization, if you can find an organization where they treat people well, there are career opportunities. So there's room to be promoted, to grow, and that you're going to learn. And again, there's opportunities to advance in your career. And it is hard work, right? So you do have to work hard. That is a great organization to transition into, because that's an organization where, for the most part, you're going to be treated fairly. If you work hard and you're smart, and not necessarily just smart, but if you work hard and you're successful in your job, that there is opportunity to be recognized and to be promoted into greater responsibility and start building that career, right? So I think, to your question on how was I thinking about McKinsey at the time, I was thinking very ambitiously of like, let me go do this, let me go do this, let me go be in charge of more and more and more. In retrospect, and I'm happy with every decision that I've made along the way, but I do advise people who are thinking about leaving organizations that are actually very well structured with great promotion opportunities and really, respectable pay, to consider staying longer and consider that as more of a career versus just being overly ambitious and thinking that if you leave there, everything's going to be so easy, right? Because, especially over the past few years, the economy's been up and down. Nothing in life is guaranteed. And I've seen people leave really great organizations and then struggle for years.
Kris, do you say that out of hindsight, wishing you could rewrite some of your story? Or is that, I guess I'm curious where that comes from. I noticed on LinkedIn, you have less than 3 years at each job that you've been in since leaving the military, readily excluded. So your current business has been longer than that, of course. But is that wishing that you had gone deeper at some organizations, or where does that advice come from? I'm just curious.
I think I'm fortunate in that I would say the decisions I made at the time to transition from one role to the next were as informed they could be at the time, given my understanding of the world. And I'm fortunate that they've all gone reasonably well, right? And that I've been able to build my toolkit, get more responsibility, get exposure, be successful in my roles, and then go to be who I am, right? Doing what I'm doing now, which I would not be successful at what I'm doing now. I wouldn't have been as equipped had I not gone through those decisions. That being said, I also now looking back recognize that some of those were not necessarily there were great organizations I worked at that I could have, stayed longer and built more of a career there for sure. And that my decisions to leave were I wouldn't say immature, but not entirely mature.
Yeah.
It was
I think it's
ego, or it could have just been frustration on things. I want to be working on something more exciting when the thing I was working on was actually, in hindsight, pretty engaging. And then, again, going back to putting in the work that like maybe the thing you're working on right now isn't the most exciting thing, but like overall, it's a good organization. There's other exciting things happening. You just gotta like
Mhm.
put in the time.
I think it's really helpful advice. It just surprised me given your track record. And I was actually planning on asking you if you recommend, shorter tenures at places because a lot of people leave the military with the expectation or with the kind of false presumption that they have to spend a decade at what their next decision is or whatever company they move to first. And so it's really a false binary, but I'm just curious, I was planning on diving into that with you if you'd recommend moving on quicker and having a more arrayed perspective and background versus going deep at one place.
So yeah, that's a great question. I think my advice is as you're looking for roles, finding roles where you're building your toolkit, but I would say it has to be really look for hard skills that are industry competencies like sales, like financial, whether it's financial modeling, due diligence, management, things that are like really tangible hard skills versus I'm a good leader, I'm a good manager. Those are more important, but they're more soft skills. And it's harder to take that, especially if you're like, well, I ran this random specific process for this company and then but I was really good at doing that process. And I'm generally a pretty hardworking, smart person. So I want to go do this next job that's like somewhat similar. That's a harder transition versus saying like, I am really good at supply chain logistics. I'm really good at sales, et cetera. So finding roles where you are building a harder toolkit. Um, and then in terms of like how long you stay at a place, yeah, I mean, in your first 6 months, you generally are still just trying to get up to speed. For me, there was natural transition points that were happening, but I do think like 3 or 4 years being at an organization, having a chance to get promoted, taking on more leadership opportunity, as somebody who looks at people when we're trying to hire and have interviewed a ton of people over my career, you're looking for people that have demonstrated growth in their role, demonstrated initiative. So as they're not what I would call plate spinners, where they stepped into a job where like everything was already running and then they did that and like really nothing changed. Maybe there's like growth that happened, but it's not really clear whether it was because of them doing anything exceptional or they just sort of did their job. So having an opportunity within that organization to take on more responsibility or additional projects or some new initiative where it's very clearly like you are really good as a person and that story can be told while you're in that organization. And if you're at a place for like 2 years, it's harder to demonstrate that, right? Now, if you're in a very fast-paced organization, you can do that, certainly. In McKinsey, some of the projects are literally 3 weeks, right? So there is more opportunity to do that. But I would say that there's about 3 or 4 years. And then there is absolutely benefit. If you're at a great organization, it is growing, you're being compensated fairly, and you stay there for 6, 7, 8 years, there's obviously a lot of value to that, especially if you're becoming more and more of a domain expert in something like one of the fields that I've mentioned, right? Because, my wife is an executive recruiter and she hires any VP or above level at a massive tech company, and they're not looking for generalists. They're always looking for somebody that like has done this before and has been really successful at it at a specific set of companies.
I like what you mentioned there, and I've actually heard that in applying that to the interview process too. So for people transitioning out, right? Asking the question on like where they see your ability to provide impact and actually grow within the organization and within the role can help
Yeah.
inform. If you're looking at a number of different jobs, say you've got 5 on your short list, maybe there's one company that has a clear understanding of how you can be the most impactful, and the others might not be able to clearly articulate that. And I think, that might help inform your decision as to
Hmm.
where, especially if it is seen as a transitionary role, maybe something that you're not going to want to do for the next 20 years, but it is something you're looking to provide that growth and the ability for you to learn. Asking those questions during the interview process can also help inform that process.
Yeah, and one additional way to think about this, and this is just from my perspective, and this doesn't apply to every situation, but in some ways, like you want to build that toolkit in your 30s. You want to be demonstrating that toolkit and like getting into those increasing levels of leadership and responsibility in your 40s. And then you're going to be building more of that like wealth that you're trying to achieve really in your 50s to some degree. There are no shortage of people that like, oh, I crushed it. I'm 28. Like I'm on Instagram. Look at me. I'm in Dubai. Or people that sold their company at 35. Like there's always those people, but as a percentage, they are an extremely small group. Even in the business school world, I have
Mhm.
classmates that literally sold their company for like $200 million 3 years out of business school, right? Or they're running multi-billion-dollar companies. But there are plenty of people that are not in that situation. And there are people that frankly are in the same job that they had when they graduated, or even a job that they held before they even went to business school, and they've built really great careers and they've been very successful because they put in that time. But this idea of building, you really want to build that foundation in your 30s, get to prove your experience and get those leadership roles and set yourself up in your 40s so that you're not like 32 and then you're picking a job because it pays 20% more. But to your point, Jack, it doesn't give you that opportunity to take on that initiative, to learn that next skill. And as a result, you're sort of like chasing that dollar that in many ways you'll almost never get because you're making these like shorter term decisions to maybe get paid a little bit more. And we see it. We've had stories of people that they'll go from us to Google or wherever, and they're like, I mean, they're spending their entire year barely writing anything that matters, right? So now they got paid more, but then 10 years down the road, what are they doing in their career, right? And many of them will go on to be successful. So I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is putting in that time, being more focused on what is it that I'm doing? What's the value that I'm doing? How is that helping me grow as a person and be more competitive and bring more tools into my toolkit so that, 5 years, 10 years down the road, I can go do the things that I feel I should be doing with my life.
I think that's such a helpful question to ask when facing one of those decisions. Is this the best environment in which I can grow? Or, is it staying at this company that's compensating me fairly and has good opportunity for advancement, or is it another opportunity that I have? Because it's so easy to fall into that trap of, I was in the military, wasn't paid what I think I'm worth or what I could get paid in the civilian world. So it's easy to want to chase that dollar, like you mentioned, but it's such a helpful question. Is this the best place to grow? And let that question inform decisions rather than just chasing the paycheck or chasing something that's a little more elusive and may not help in the long run, like you mentioned.
Nowadays seems like it's very popular to jump ship for the pay raise. And I think it's my
Yeah.
generation, I suppose, but there's a lot of articles I've seen. It's like that's kind of almost the recommendation is like try to move on to the next thing in order to get the pay raise. But the pay raise isn't always the long term, the growth, the development. That's not always the right call for what's going to be effective in a decade.
Yeah. I mean, I saw an article today that it was an article that was like if you keep 60% of your VPs, then you're doing well. Meaning you might get that pay raise into a job that you're not actually that great at, and you might not be successful there. So that's also something you have to think about.
Yep. So transitioning into your time at Palantir, can you talk about your experience there, how that was correlated to what you learned and some of the hard skills you developed at McKinsey, and then how that later informed your next couple ventures?
Yeah, I stepped into a role at Palantir where they wanted to bring in some people who had more senior client hands. So as Palantir was growing at the time, they were getting into bigger organizations where there were more senior executives, older executives that were looking to interface with people that had been trained to work with them, essentially. And McKinsey is very strong at client engagement. And I got put into a project pretty early on where they needed somebody with that type of training to go interface with the client executives. And there was some challenges with the project, and there was a lot of confusion amongst the stakeholders and so on. And the team was working on a bunch of things at the same time, and it wasn't necessarily well organized. And my job was to basically go in and talk to the client, talk to the executives, get them calmed down, and talk to all the stakeholders, really understand what they needed, what they wanted. And this was going back to the beginning of like asking the 50 questions, going to every person, asking so many questions that I could understand what one person, and there was like 10 or 15 different stakeholders, what every one of them actually wanted, and then go start talking about that to everybody else and saying, and especially at the leadership, say, what is actually the most important thing to do? So it was that, the McKinsey sort of problem solving. How do we take a bunch of requests that were coming in from all of the different stakeholders, put that into like really almost like a 2x2 matrix? What's going to give us, what's the hardest to implement with the engineering team versus the easiest? What's going to be the impact on the organization? Mapping that all out, getting everybody to sit down together and agree what's the thing that we actually need to do. So it was some of that project management skills, being able to take a lot of data inputs, organize them. That's really almost like the bread and butter of consulting, and applying that in that Palantir setting, which at the time there was a lot more that just wasn't their process at the time. And I'll say that.
You mentioned you had been interested in Palantir, long before it was a company that had interested you. Was that kind of in your purview, in your sights the whole time? Was try and find a role there? Or did you network your way into it, or how? Because I'm sure people getting out of the military have something that's kind of their, it'd be a great organization to work at, or kind of is their golden goose. But how did you work out actually making it there?
I was interested because at the time, just being at business school at Stanford, you start to learn who were the innovative tech companies. And at the time, there was really no innovation to that degree in the defense sector. And I had just obviously come from the defense sector. So I was interested in a really like a Silicon Valley approach to improving technology for the government. And there was like an Office of Defense Innovation at the time. I think this was under Obama. And yeah, it was just, these are people that are trying to push technology forward into the government, which again, I had mentioned that going to business school for me was, how do I learn the commercial side of things and then somehow bring that knowledge combined with my military experience into the public sector or the private sector in a way that brings it all together. And that for me was an organization that really brought it all together. And yeah, it was a combination. I was fortunate enough to have some business school classmates who were connected to the company, and they also were looking for people like me. And because I had talked to some folks and expressed an interest in the company, they were also then talking to those same people saying, do you know anybody who could be a fit? And that's how some of the introductions were made. Again, it's just like talking to people and trying to, saying these are the type of things I'm interested in, asking questions.
Yeah, I love the theme of asking questions and being genuinely curious, which is woven through all of your experiences and your whole story. I mean, that goes such a long way in getting to the right opportunities for you, but also the opportunities that you genuinely want. Hopefully you were given some Palantir stock options and you had the foresight to hold those, because if I could go back a few years, one of the best financial decisions would be to and put all the chips on Palantir, given they're outpacing the crypto run and other things as well.
Yeah, I sold half, kept half. I've with my approach to crypto has been I will never be able to invest enough comfortably. I would never be comfortable investing enough money that it'll ever make a meaningful difference in my life.
Fair enough. It's well put. Well, not to gloss over your role at Citi Bike or other roles after Palantir, because you had a successful exit and all kinds of things, but I want to get to readily what you're currently working on, of course. So you mentioned at Palantir getting proficient and already having experience pushing technology into government. Can you talk about how you're using that experience and how you're using some of those additional, going back to the hard skills that you learned at previous endeavors? Can you talk about using that and how it's really helped readily?
Yeah, so everything I've ever done in my life, post Naval Academy has been high technology in either the public or the private sector. So submarines, of course, McKinsey working on the Joint Strike Fighter program, Palantir running, major government projects, automating workflows from months down to minutes, looking for bad guys and finding them. And then even Citi Bike, it really is. I mean, we were supporting 80,000 rides a day, 500-person unionized workforce, running a profitable business. There's no way you can do that unless you're pushing automation into every single part of the business. So it was customer support, marketing, sales, truck routing, triaging bikes as they're coming into the facility, you name it. So for me, I've always worked on automation almost my entire career post-academy. And so it made sense for me to really continue to pursue that. I understood the technology and more exposure to AI and especially automation and what it could do for organizations and what it could do for people. And was fortunate to meet my co-founder 3.5 years ago. He had a very deep background in AI and ML, working with portfolio companies, and had been really successful there. And we decided to, hitch our wagons together. We spent the first year talking to about 200 different companies, understanding what their problems were, with an eye of also going into the federal space. And we started building out really an AI agent network that can be quickly configured to solve unique problems in the way that Palantir was a pretty comprehensive platform that could be unique, could be configured fairly quickly. We took a very similar approach. And right now we're about 85% commercial revenue, 15% government, but we've been really pushing hard into getting deeper into the local and state government space. We had been building for about 2 years, and when we looked at the local and state government space, we felt an immediate and significant pull for our technology. And when we looked at the incumbents and the existing technology in the space versus what we had built, it was very clear that we were a 10x better solution. And so today I continue to say this and I continue to not be proven wrong, that we have the most advanced citizen-facing AI in the country right now that we are working to deploy to, more and more cities. So by the end of this month, we'll be live in 3 states. We should be live in 6 states by the end of January, if not more.
That's awesome. And for the person thinking, can I just type in a chat GPT, explain to me like I'm a 4th grader what readily.ai does? Can you explain in that, to someone who may not understand the technology side of it or just a high level of the company?
Yeah, so look, I'm a dad of 2. I don't have time to call town hall at 2 p.m. I also don't have the patience to navigate a 1,000-page website and try to figure out what form I'm supposed to fill out, or true story, end up logging or going into some, government portal to try to renew my dog's license, which then breaks or loses my information. And then I have to go start over again. And then whatever button doesn't highlight. It's just incredibly painful. And every person listening to this right now has their own story of a very painful, probably pretty recent experience or very inefficient experience working with their county, state, or local municipality. Imagine if instead of you being the operator of that entire information system and you having to go find the right piece of information, you having to figure out where to book a tennis court or how to sign your kids up for swim lessons or how to fill out a building permit, or upgrade your bathroom or whatever. Like all of those things, the routine things that we have to interface with our local governments for. Imagine if instead of you having to figure out how to do all of that and you being the operator of that system, when you can't figure it out, you pull in the town. Instead, you're the client, right? All you have to do is go to a single interface, a single AI agent, and you say, this is what I'm trying to do. This is my problem. And the AI agent gets the information. Doesn't matter if it's on whatever 1,000 pages or buried deep in some 500-page PDF, or frankly, even on like the adjacent county website or something like that, closed off from the internet. So it's only official government information, gives you the answer, helps you fill out a permit application, helps you apply for a microloan, helps you renew your dog license, and it can execute all of those processes for you. And by the way, in the background, for the government staff, if there's multiple steps to that process, where once your permit gets approved, it then needs to go to this person for review, et cetera, it can automate all of those functions. And so we as citizens and we as municipal staff are no longer operators of the system. We are the clients of it. And that's what the future should be. And that's what we're building.
Sounds incredible.
Saving people time and headaches is a great business model. And if you're incorporating the AI piece, I mean, that is the future of how, AI is going to be a layer on everything that we're doing.
But it's not just the time and the energy. If you think about it, government does not have the option of only serving 95% of citizens. If they leave 5% of people behind, that's a failure, right? Even if they leave one person behind, you could argue that's a failure. So how do you bring government services to every single last person? There are a lot of people left behind right now, not just because of what you might think of, well, they're homeless, but there's also people that just don't speak the language. They're not comfortable speaking that language. Look, my mom's a U.S. citizen. She's been a U.S. citizen for an extremely long time. She speaks a little bit less English every single day. And so for her to interact with these systems is hard, right? So you're leaving people behind because of technology competency, technology literacy, language capability, but then also me, right? Like I speak perfect English, master's degree. I can't access my city systems because I'm doing all of this stuff at 10:30 at night and these systems are terrible. So there are a lot of people being left behind. And how do you bring government services to every single last person exactly when they need it, right? So that there's a bigger mission here that just gets me really excited every single day.
Jack, the good thing is there's no regulation in Hawaii, right? So this isn't needed out there.
Yeah, none. Yeah. No regulation. Yeah, he's referencing the bane of my existence is the Hawaii regulation for all things business and all things everything, really.
That's
But
wild. Do you have to register your skateboard, Jack?
yeah, the 3 skateboards that I have, yeah.
What if it's a unicycle? Do you have to register the unicycle?
You get a discount, which is great. They're really looking out for the clowns in Hawaii.
Yeah, but only 1/3. It's not even half like it should be.
Yeah, right. Oh, no.
Kris, this is a completely apolitical question here, but do you feel like you are you have some tailwinds given the Department of Government, regulate the kind of the government efficiency stuff that's happening at the federal level? Do you think that provides tailwinds to what you're doing, i.e., fewer government employees because an AI agent is taking care of a lot of jobs?
Yeah, it's so I do believe there are tailwinds in the sense that there is a lot of concern around AI to the extent that and frankly, some of it's being pushed by the bigger legacy companies in the background that they're trying to slow down the innovation. And it's actually Silicon Valley and a lot of business leaders that are now in greater positions of authority they'll be in greater positions of authority with the federal government that aren't going to put excessive regulations on companies like us. We are very secure. We're SOC 2 Type 2. We're HIPAA compliant. We're GDPR compliant. We follow National Institutes of Technology, AI risk management framework. We don't hallucinate. There's no bias that we've been able to find evidence of. And some of the regulations that some people would like to put in place would still like crush a business like ours. So I do think there is a greater willingness for this type of technology amongst a lot of the Silicon Valley business minds. And they do have apolitically, they will have more of a voice in the current government. And that I think will also flow through at state and local level as well. And the reality is for us, more along the lines of tailwinds, is that this is all happening in real time, guys, right? Like people are increasingly interfacing with AI in their private lives, and they're interfacing with AI in their commercial lives when they're going to buy, underwear, shoes, and they're seeing what these technologies can do. If they're parents and they have kids that are in that sort of middle school age that are starting to use some of these systems, they're seeing it. So the buyers for us are more and more educated on the technology every single day, which makes it when we're talking to somebody about what we can do and this vision that I just painted for you, they actually understand what that means because you guys immediately were like, oh, well, that's how I'm interacting, whether it's ChatGPT or I just bought something online. And like, what that means. What I just told you, you actually can visualize that. Whereas I think, 10 years in the past, when you're trying to pitch a technology that most people really, they just don't fundamentally understand what that would mean. So there is that tailwind, I would say societally. And more importantly, there isn't going to be, I do believe there needs to be AI regulation. And frankly, we will benefit from that because we take this so seriously. And there's a lot of Wild West stuff out there. So we will benefit from increasing regulation, but not to the point where it just crushes everybody.
From an onboarding perspective, just a random question here, but is it as simple as feeding all of the government, whatever local municipal government data they have, feeding that into the model, and that takes care of, how simple is it to inform these models or inform the agent to do the task that all these tasks that it would need to do?
There are pieces of it that are pretty simple. So there's a lot of information just on a town website. You can go create a webhook and synchronize with it. We synchronize with town websites every night. There are parts of it that require technical integration. So getting an API key to access a municipal code system, a permitting system, and that requires obviously the approval of the town as well as the buy-in from the GovTech platform that runs that system. And then there's just the institutional knowledge of there are specific workflows that have to be built out. There's specific information that resides within the brains of the staff in terms of how they like to do things, how processes need to be carried out. And then we have a configurable infrastructure that allows us to complete all of those actions very quickly. One of the things that we do really well, it's an AI agent network. We can tap into any system. We can build out very complicated workflows. We can execute them as a conversation with the user rather than a decision tree of if you do this, then this. Conversation, we can have it in any language with any user, and we ask follow-up questions. There's a lot of innovation that we're doing right now. But the overall onboarding can be very quick. It just comes down to how quickly can we get access to the systems and then interview the staff, asking lots of questions, making sure you understand, and then that's where you can get that next level of value for them.
How do you, I guess, what would you say as far as like guidance or advice on how you focus on explaining these things to people who are in those government positions who may literally have no idea, they're not in this space at all, but they need to give those permissions to you, or do you even have to get permissions from people, and how do you explain that to them?
I was wondering the same thing. I imagine that's a common frustration is getting buy-in and accessing these GovTech platforms that are probably incredibly antiquated themselves.
So most modern software has APIs that allows you to connect to their system and do different things, whether that's read and write, read only, etc., update. So that already exists. I would say most city managers are familiar with these terms because the software landscape, and even in a small city, small town, like 5,000 people, they might be using 6 or 7 different platforms. And so they've already had to go through the process of having some of those platforms integrate with each other. So they're familiar with all those concepts. And ultimately, every town has a website. You're not going to I'd be hard pressed. There are probably some very the towns out there that might just be very, but not technology illiterate. I actually kind of would find that fairly hard to believe these days. In terms of the value prop, I mean, they are constantly answering emails, picking up phone calls, responding to people walking in for stuff that is just very routine. And there's a certain amount of their time in any given city or town. There is a percentage of the staff, and it's not small, could be anywhere from 10 to even 30, 40% of the staff that is just responding to routine things that, frankly, that not information exists. It's just people can't figure out how to access it. Sometimes the staff themselves. And so
Right.
their job really almost comes down to they knowing what form you're supposed to fill out or where that piece of information is. And if you can offboard that from them, they now have all that time to work on things that are actually much more critical for the town. That could be related to strategic initiatives. It could be related to homelessness. It could be related to business development that are
Right.
like great, driving the greater good rather than just kind of just helping people coming in and out of the door that frankly don't necessarily want to be coming in and out of that door. Like me, I don't want to go in that door.
Exactly.
I want to
Yeah.
solve my problem immediately at 10:30 at night.
Yes. And that's interesting because like people who are contributing the most to society might not have the time to do
I'm
the
doing
things that are the
this.
simplest things in you know.
They're the last ones
So I
we
tell
want
investors.
standing in town hall.
That's what I tell investors. If I'm explaining to them, I'm like, I'm doing this right now. This is what I do. Like, or I'm talking to clients, or I'm, you know, managing sale or whatever, right? This is what I'm doing. I'm not trying to, I'm not getting my car and driving down to town hall because this is when it's convenient for them. And I appreciate the fact that that staff is there and they work hard. I get it, right? The point is they have certain hours that they're there that absolutely do not overlap with my life or frankly, most people's lives.
100%. Well, Kris, such an awesome solution to such a pressing problem that everyone deals with. And huge congrats, by the way, on being recognized as one of the fastest military growing startups. I feel like that's, a very well-deserved recognition that you fairly recently have received. But, one two-part question that we ask every guest of the show is one ask and
Sure.
one give. So it's, one way that people listening to this could add value or help you. And then the second part is one way that you could, provide value or help other people. And you've provided a lot of advice already.
Yeah. In terms of what I can give, I have a diverse background. I understand the transition out of the military and having to think through your career. So I'm more than happy to jump on the phone with most anybody. I don't have a ton of time, but I always try to take the call and spend a half hour and try to make it a meaningful conversation with folks, unless I absolutely can't. But I always try to find the time, even if it's on the weekend. So I'm happy to share my experiences and offer advice, at least from my perspective. Happy to do that.
Awesome.
In terms of where I could benefit from the community, if you know you're a local official, elected or non-elected, city manager, assistant city managers, communications directors, anybody like that in your town, and if you know that your town could benefit from this type of technology, I would certainly love a chance to at least speak with your town. What we've found is that many, 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 many thousands of towns, they are looking for this. They're thinking about this type of solution and they just don't necessarily know where to go. And a lot of the existing platforms in the space, frankly, are not very good. And so if somebody out there is thinking about this as a service for their residents or their citizens, we want to make sure that they know that we're out here and that we at least get a chance to have an at bat to show them what we can do and the value that we bring and how we can help their citizens. So if that's you out there, please, I would appreciate an intro.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that it's 85/15. What is the commercial application that you see most used for Readily?
It's been customer support automation.
Okay.
So fully automating customer support. We respond to emails. We can respond to text messages. The biggest ones would be just being a AI agent on the website, whether you're logged in or logged out. So for logged out, it could be people that are trying to understand the product more, scheduling, they want to schedule a demo. So it's a bit of almost like that sales intake, educating the customer, answering their questions, potential customer. And then if you're logged in, and that could be a B2B or a B2C, it's not just, it's answering questions, also can help with troubleshooting, updating databases, updating records. And then we can respond to emails as well. So there are clients where we've fully automated like 70% of their customer support. And it's been really game changing for their teams. And that these are B2B SaaS. This can be software logistics, sorry, logistics, technology-enabled logistics, retail, even food and beverage. We've been fairly agnostic on the commercial side. We do see huge opportunity on the government side, but we plan on keeping a certain percentage of commercial revenue because we believe that those customers are pushing us to be better. They're pushing us to work on harder problems and to really push our technology forward much faster than what we would see if we were only working in the government space. So there is a flywheel that we have benefited from, which is why when we came into the government space, we were immediately the industry leader, and we're going to continue to maintain that flywheel.
What does it actually look like? So let's say I'm searching on my county or city website. Does it pop up as like a chat GPT type chat box where you just type in your question and it has a prompt there, like what can I help you with kind of thing? Or what does it actually look like if you're the citizen trying to, using Readily that has been applied by that municipality?
Mhm. Yeah, so it could just be a chatbot on the website. We are working to also just power search bars as well. It could be you're sending an email into the town, whether it's a general inbox or a certain department, it could be Public Works at. We can respond to those emails. And what we're working on releasing for Q1 is if you call, right? So if you call the general line, that we can actually take that call, you can conduct that conversation in any language you like, and that we can answer your questions and actually execute some of these workflows. There's a tree down. Again, how do I renew this license, et cetera. So
Wow,
it's all of the normal methods of communication, except now instead of you having to go do all the work, you're just interfacing with an AI agent.
sounds great. I'm about to call my county tomorrow because right now they're closed, to Chris's point.
Yeah.
And Kris, I know you just recently closed an oversubscribed funding round. Are you raising capital? Free chance to plug anyone who's interested in supporting Readily in any other way?
Yeah, we're certainly interested in meeting investors. We are planning to raise our next major round in the spring. There is an opportunity to pull forward some of that capital, which we could benefit from. We just finished, as you mentioned, we finished a fundraising sprint that ended up being oversubscribed. So I've been actually quite excited to get back into talking to clients and building. So we're not really running a big process right now, but we are still talking to firms.
And then
Nice.
Jack, I don't know. One question I've been thinking about for Kris is, given your, and this is a slight tangent away from Readily for a second, but if given all your diverse experience from the Navy and then all the experience we talked about since then, if you could go back to when you were leaving the military, kind of helping folks that are transitioning out now, if you could go back to when you were leaving, are there things that you would do differently along the way, or would you kind of chart the same path? You can only connect the dots looking backwards. So how would you reconnect any dots if you would?
Yeah, I think I would have invested more in having more meaningful relationships with the people that I was reporting to. I had great relationships with my peers, and because that's just sort of the people that you're interacting with day to day. It's sort of like in the submarine context, those are your crew to some extent. I didn't spend as much time investing in having really deep, meaningful relationships with my superiors and the folks up the chain. And that's one where I would have put much more time in. I also think in I actually now better understand what those leaders were going through, having now stepped into their shoes in some way. So I also would have, I think, just approached those relationships differently in terms of my understanding of what they were going through and the stresses they were under. And just been, I think, more empathetic and again, just try to get to know them better and how I can be more supportive of them specifically. I was always out there doing my job and trying to do my job the best I could. But that there's kind of an extra element of that like relationship with your leadership. I would have spent more time there. Well, and they're just, in the end, at some point, especially as you're growing, then their experiences at the time become more relevant for you now. And then as you're growing, then your experiences potentially become relevant for them. And so it can be a good two-way street. But from a networking perspective, then yeah, these are people that can continue to be important in your life going forward. And investing that time, I think, is well spent.
Are there some of these people that you've held on to or kept preserved relationships with as mentors to this day and continue to to seek advice or counsel from? Or is that kind of a different train of thought?
I would say I've never had like an explicit mentor in that capacity. Um, it's more so that like my peers that I invested time in getting to know and classmates from business school, they've themselves grown into substantial business leaders. And so there is value in like also having great relationships with other people you're working around. Because now at this point of our career, they provide great advice. They can be mentors in their own right. So that I've been able to benefit from that. And also similarly, like other people that I'm now able to be a resource for them
Yeah.
at that peer level.
You've got a unique scenario, but there was like more questions from Griffin and I about like your specific thing, just because we're interested in what you're doing, I think. And I think that's great. I think this will be a valuable episode for anybody listening and trying to make a transition. So thank you.
Well, no intention of blowing up your LinkedIn or otherwise, Kris, but if I were transitioning out of the military today or tomorrow or in the next X number of months, I would be messaging Kris and finding a way to get on a call with you because, yeah, you've got such invaluable advice. Kris, as we wrap it up here, again, thank you for taking the time. This has been amazing, as Jack mentioned. Do you have any final thoughts or kind of parting words of advice for people that are transitioning out of the military or considering making that transition?
So first off, thanks you guys for having me. I certainly I've had a very interesting path, and there are lessons to be learned, and I'm happy to share them to the extent that it can be helpful for others. And then the two parting thoughts are ones that I've already mentioned. One is that there is value in being at a mature organization where there is potential for career progression. They treat you well. You're going to work hard. You're going to learn a lot. That is important. That doesn't mean that's the only place to go, but don't discount that. The second thing is what I had mentioned earlier, which is, do the hard work. And the hard work is not just showing up, it's actually thinking really hard and putting in that effort and building that toolbox in your 30s, trying to get into those leadership positions in your 40s, and then hopefully building that wealth in your 50s and being okay with that timeline and not being frustrated or disappointed because you're not, driving a Ferrari when you're 30.
Well said. Yeah, the Ferrari guys are the ones that make the Instagram, but not the typical experience.
Yeah,
What's
you
up for
can't live
Jack?
your life just constantly comparing yourself to others. And my last piece of advice is like just always be thinking about the long view of like, 401k, et cetera. But to that point of like chasing the next dollar, like be able to cover your costs at any given point in time. If you're able to save a little bit extra, then that's great. But like, optimizing for your career and taking the salary that does what you need it to do at that time of your life is okay. That you don't need to be getting paid a lot more because your friend is getting paid that much, right? If you don't actually need it, and if the trade-off is a suboptimal sort of career move.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Veteran Ventures podcast. If you heard something interesting or found the show to be helpful, send it to a friend who is transitioning out of the military or considering a transition. We'd also really appreciate if you left a rating and review of the show. That helps us reach more people with these amazing stories of successful veterans. We'll catch you next time on the Veteran Ventures podcast. And until then, go do the thing. Make that decision, have that conversation, and go find your next mission.